Well, I think John gave me a better introduction than I could ever give for myself, so I think what remains is just to say thank you. I'm really appreciative for the invitation to come and be with you over the next few days and present these lessons. I've been in Kingston a few times over the past few years. In fact, the first time I visited with the church here, I think it was 2002, 2003, when they met in the Stewart's home. My son, who's now 11, vomited all over the furniture at their house. He was less than 1 year old and was sick during that time. And so we made our impressions very strong from the beginning. But we have visited here with you a few times in your various locations over the years, but always, as I said to someone, just for a few hours, it seems. So to have the full weekend to get to know my family better here in this area is really special to me. And so I'm thankful for your invitation. I'm also excited to teach these particular lessons because the topic of Messianic prophecies and prophecies in general is a really exciting thing to me. I've always enjoyed thinking about these things, reading, studying, and understanding them. And so I hope the things that I present to you this weekend are encouraging for you and edifying for you. And I want to encourage you, if you have any questions about the things that I present, I'm interested in nothing but truth. And I want you to ask your questions. I understand these lessons are going to be broadcast online, so let me just take the moment to say, if you're listening online or watching online, please contact the group that meets here if you have questions about the things that you hear. And they're interested in nothing but the Lord's truth as well. And so please keep that in mind as we go through the things that we're talking about. Let me introduce you to Mr. Peter W. Stoner, professor. In the year 1952, Professor Stoner published a book called Science Speaks. At the time, Stoner was chairman of the departments of mathematics and astronomy at Pasadena City College in California. And a year later, he would be appointed as chairman of the science division at Westmont College. Professor Stoner was a fellow who had observed that in the generation before his own, the conclusion of scientists had been used to critically attack the Bible, to the point where the faith of many people, and young people especially, as he was a professor, had been wrecked because they thought that the Bible couldn't be trusted if it wasn't consistent with the findings of scientists. And yet Mr. Stoner was convinced that more recent advances in the sciences in his generation not only disproved the attacks of the past, but they also positively supported the Bible. And so he wrote this book. And in this book, Science Speaks, Stoner discussed those recent findings of science in the 1950s and how they were consistent with the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. He discussed the accurate fulfillment of some of the various Old Testament prophecies concerning nations and cities like Tyre and Babylon and Jericho. And most famously, he discussed some of the prophecies that came true concerning Jesus the Christ. And in particular, he attempted to estimate the numerical probability that one man could fulfill these prophecies concerning the Christ. Though Professor Stoner's book was first released in 1952 and then revised in 1963, it was apparently not till about 1972 that his work became widely known and began receiving critical attention. And the reason for this is that some of his conclusions were published in another book that may possibly be on your bookshelf at home. It's a well-known book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by the apologist Josh McDowell, a book that attempts to systematically document various evidences for the Christian faith. On page 167 of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, McDowell attempts to demonstrate that it's impossible to say that it's simply a matter of coincidence that Jesus, one man, fulfilled so many prophecies. And Stoner's work had attracted McDowell's attention. What Stoner had done was taken just 8 of the prophecies concerning the Christ, and he, from these, calculated his estimate of the mathematical probability that one man could fulfill them all. Some of these may be familiar to you. The Christ would be born in the town of Bethlehem. The Christ would enter as king on a colt, a foal of a donkey, into Jerusalem. Pierced hands and feet. And we're going to talk about each one of these, but these 8 were the ones that Mr. Stoner had looked at. And so McDowell, in his book, took quotes out of Stoner's book, and here's perhaps the most famous quote that was included. Mr. Stoner said, "We find that the chance that any man might have lived down to the present time and fulfilled all 8 of these prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 17th power." That is a 1, and if I had a whiteboard, I would write it up there. I think it's greater effect when you start writing a 1 with 17 zeros behind it, because that's what 1 in 10 to the 17th power is. That's 100,000 trillions. So take a trillion, another trillion, and take 100,000 of those trillions, and that's how big of a number we're talking about. It is a ridiculously large number. Well, Professor Stoner had written as an illustration just how large this number was, and so McDowell quoted that as well, and here's what he said. He said, "Suppose that we take 10 to the 17th silver dollars and lay them on the face of Texas." We all know Texas. Texas is very proud that everything in Texas is big. Texas as a state is big. He says, let's say we take 10 to the 17th silver dollars and lay them on the face of Texas. They will cover all of the state 2 feet deep. Now, just take one of them. Mark one of these silver dollars. Stir the whole mass thoroughly, if you can imagine that, all over the state. Blindfold a man and tell him that he can travel as far as he wishes. But he must reach down, pick up 1 silver dollar, take off his blindfold, and that's the right one. What chance would he have of getting the right one? Well, he said just the same chance that the prophets would have had in writing these 8 prophecies and having them all come true in any one man from their day to the present time, providing that they wrote in their own wisdom. You know, if it wasn't of God, is what he's saying. Now, these prophecies were either given by inspiration of God or the prophets just wrote them as they thought they should be. In such a case, the prophets had just one chance in 10 to the 17th of having them come true in any man. But they all came true in Christ. Do you see the point being made? Just to have 8 prophecies come true in one man randomly from the time of the prophets until now is, for all intents and purposes, impossible. And in fact, Mr. Stoner, if you look at his book, goes on to consider 48 prophecies that came true in Jesus, and the amazingly higher probability that one man could randomly fulfill it. When he gets down to an illustration, I think he talks about electrons and things on the microscopic level. I mean, it is ridiculous. Jesus fulfilled them all. And the conclusion is, therefore, it must not be random. It must be of God. Fulfilled Messianic prophecy is, as I said earlier, exciting to me. It's breathtaking to consider the power of fulfilled Messianic prophecy. What is it exactly? The word prophecy means a foretelling or a prediction of what is to come. You can see in the word itself the idea of a prediction. The pro part of the word prophecy means what? Before. And the fussy part of the word comes from a root meaning to speak. And so the word literally means to speak before. But since only God would be able to accurately foretell or predict the future, the word prophecy also came to refer to any divine or inspired message. And that's important for us to think about. Who but God can accurately tell the future? In Isaiah 49, verses 9 and 10, God speaks of himself, and he says through the prophet, I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. In other words, God says that his uniqueness, his power, his glory are demonstrated by his ability to accurately declare the future to us. Wayne Jackson, in an article called Principles of Bible Prophecy, points out that real divine prophecy involves at least these three qualities. I want you to think about them with me. Number one, the quality of proper timing. What he means by that is the prophecy must significantly precede, significantly come before the person or event described. It must be beyond the realm of reasonable calculation so as to preclude the possibility of an educated guess. And the illustration is, if somebody prophesies that it's going to rain tomorrow when you already know a weather front is moving in, well, that's hardly evidence of divine inspiration. It's hardly evidence of God. Look at what Isaiah 46 and verse 10 says. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, times long ago, things that are still in the future. That's what we're talking about when we say proper timing. God has the ability, years and years past, to talk about things that haven't even happened yet. Number two, specific details. Not vague generalities which are capable of being manipulated to fit various circumstances. And what he means by this is to predict that someone will do something at some time is not a terribly impressive thing. You have to give details. As an example, in the context of Isaiah 46, God has just said that there is a conquering man named Cyrus who is going to come from the east in the future and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. And at the time he's saying this, the city's still standing. And the temple's still standing. They haven't even been destroyed yet. Because this man is going to come 150 years later. The detail is the name Cyrus. Well, the prophet was told the name of the man that's going to come in the future. That's the kind of detail that we're talking about. We call that fulfilled prophecy, a prophecy that's proven to come true. Third, exact fulfillment. It's not enough to say that a prophecy is 80% accurate. It's not enough to say a prophet is 80% accurate. God says, my counsel shall stand, and I will do what? All my pleasure. God would have no more glory than your local weatherman if his foretelling had a weatherman's kind of accuracy. We're not perfect. Everything that God says is going to happen, happens. Right? When we speak of fulfilled Messianic prophecy, we're referring to certain prophecies that were made by Old Testament prophets of God concerning a special person that God promised would one day come. An anointed one. That's what the word Christ means. An anointed one of God. That's what the word Messiah means as well. Many scriptures speak about this predicted one who will come. One of them is Psalm 2, where we learn that the kings of the earth would set themselves and the rulers would take counsel against the Lord and his anointed, who would be called the Son of God, as you read through the rest of that psalm. And the kings and the rulers would try to fight against him, but God would give the Son rule and power and victory and possession to the ends of the earth. And when you get to the end of the psalm, it says in verse 10, now therefore be wise, O kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. For centuries, the Jewish people were waiting for this great, powerful Christ King to come. And little by little, the prophets would reveal details and predictions about the Messiah. You know, the natural question for us to ask as well as them is, who is he? Who is this talking about? It's obviously very important to know based on verses 10 through 12. One day, in the animal stalls of an overpopulated inn in the little town of Bethlehem, a baby boy was born in the family of a Jewish carpenter. One by one, by one, by one, by one, the boy and then the man fulfills every single one of the prophecies and predictions concerning the Christ. The evidence of this fulfilled prophecy was so startling, so amazing, that it became a foundation of the preaching of the gospel in the followers of Christ. If you look in Acts chapter 17, read verses 2 and 3, when the Apostle Paul travels to the city of Thessalonica, begins preaching about Jesus there. It says, then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, particularly the Old Testament Scriptures, what this is referring to, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. You know what he was doing? He was taking those Old Testament scriptures and said, let's look at them, let's understand, what do they say about the Christ? Now let me tell you about Jesus and how he did all those things. This Jesus whom I preach to you is that one. That's first century preaching right there. It's that connection that we want to think about in this series of lessons this weekend. We are going to look into the scriptures and talk about some of these predictions that Paul would have been pointing to. Messianic prophecies that have been fulfilled in Jesus. And as we look at them, they're going to prove to us not only that Jesus is that Christ, because he matches all those prophecies, but because, as we said, so many prophecies have been fulfilled, they prove there's no coincidence going on. Instead, there really is a God, and he is really at work in making Jesus the Christ. We don't have time in 6 lessons to talk about every prophecy concerning the Christ, but that's why I've told you about Professor Stoner and the now famous quote in Josh McDowell's book. I've designed this series of lessons to especially focus on the 8 prophecies that Mr. Stoner says have a 1 in 10 to 17th chance of being fulfilled randomly in one person. And what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate these together over the next few days. We're going to talk about some of the objections that have been raised to Mr. Stoner's work. And then along the way, we're going to learn about some other messianic prophecies as well as we reference them. So this is the outline of where we're going. And tonight, in our remaining time, we're going to just take a look at the first prophecy on this list. That the Messiah, the coming king would be born in the little town of Bethlehem. The prophecy that the Christ would be born in Bethlehem was given by the prophet Micah about 700 years before Jesus was born. Think about that, 700 years before. We find it in the book of Micah, chapter 5 and verse 2. By the time that Micah was a prophet, it had already been established in Israel that God had promised to one day raise up a king, a descendant of David, whose throne and whose kingdom would be established forever, and that king became known as the Messiah, the Anointed One. In the 4th and the 5th chapters of Micah, Micah looks forward to the future kingdom of Messiah, and here's what he says. He says, but you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler in Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Out of you, Bethlehem Ephratah, shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel. The ruler is the Messiah. Some have objected, said, no, let's not jump to conclusions about this verse. Is this really about the Messiah? Maybe it's referring to another important king or ruler. It doesn't say Messiah. In response, I'd point out that the context of this section of Micah, if you've not spent any time in it, you should go take a look at it. It's clearly Messianic, and there is good evidence that traditional Jewish understanding of this section of Scripture is about the Messiah. As an example, the Jonathan Targum, which is supposed to be a first-century Jewish writing attributed to a rabbi, Jonathan ben Uzziel, contains a section where he interprets Micah 5 and verse 2. And you'll look at it and you'll say, well, that looks a lot like the verse. Well, it does, yes, but he's interpreting it by taking things that he wants to make more clear and changing it to make more clear. And look at what he writes. And you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, you who were too small to be numbered among the thousands of the house of Judah, from you shall come forth before me the Messiah. So you see, there was understanding among the Jews that that's what this verse was referring to. I should also point out that there are Jewish traditional writings that confirm Bethlehem Ephratah is referring to the town and not simply to a family or to a clan, which is another objection that's sometimes made. Bethlehem Ephratah is a town name that would be very familiar to the Jews. Jacob, the father of the Israelite nation, buried his wife Rachel close to that location in Genesis 35. And David, the beloved king of Israel, was from Bethlehem. Bruce Waltke, in his commentary on Micah, also points out that in this part of Micah, there's a contrast being made between the city of Jerusalem and the town of Bethlehem. And he says, in the context, the kings that are born in proud Jerusalem failed because they're being rebuked in this part of Micah. But the Messiah, incarnated in lowly Bethlehem, is going to triumph. In other words, it would be understood. We're talking about the town of Bethlehem here in this verse. And so with these things in mind, we shouldn't be surprised when we turn in our Bibles back to Matthew chapter 2. And when the wise men from the east, if you'll take your Bibles and turn there, Matthew chapter 2. We read that when the wise men from the east traveled to Jerusalem to meet with King Herod the Great because they've seen the star of the one who's been born, they asked King Herod, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? Look at what it says in these verses Herod asked. So it says in verse 1, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, we have no idea. That's not their answer. Verse 5, they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. When Herod said, where is he to be born? The response wasn't, we don't know, the prophets didn't tell us. And the response wasn't, somewhere in Judea. They said, Bethlehem. We know the answer to that. The prophet was clear. Now, the book of Matthew was written for all mankind. But many have noted that it seems particularly designed in the way that it's written with a Jewish audience in mind. And then they go on to say, the Roman and Greek audiences seem to be focused on in Mark and Luke. If you look at the beginning of Matthew, it begins with a family tree, a genealogy that's intended to settle the question right from the start that Jesus met the Messianic qualification of being a descendant of Abraham and a descendant of David. The reason I'm pointing this out to you is what a foolish way for Matthew to start a book if it were not understood that it was also a qualification that the Messiah be born in Bethlehem. You know what I mean? So if you're trying to convince people, particularly a Jewish audience, and you start in chapter 1 and you're showing he's a descendant of David and Abraham, and then you go into chapter 2 and say, well, it's clear that the prophecy says Bethlehem. If the majority of Jews are like, no, it's not. Where'd you get that from? It was clear. Everyone knew that Micah had predicted such a thing. In fact, in John chapter 7, if you'll turn your Bibles over there, in John chapter 7, John records a time when Jesus was teaching publicly during the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. And by the last day of the feast, there were some who were absolutely convinced that Jesus was the Christ. Then there were others who argued, no, he can't be. Why? Well, look in John 7, beginning in verse 40. Therefore, many from the crowd, when they heard this saying, said, truly, this is the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. But some said, will the Christ come out of Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the seed of David and from the town of Bethlehem where David was? And so there was a division among the people because of him. The objection was that Jesus couldn't be the Christ because the scripture said that the Christ would come from the town of Bethlehem. And you're thinking along with me, but Jesus was from the town of Bethlehem. That's right. But not everybody knew it. Right? Many thought that Jesus was from Galilee in the north part of Judea because that's where he was raised. That's where he grew up. That's where his family lived. But he was born in Bethlehem. Why didn't Jesus just get up and correct everyone? Why didn't he clear it up? Didn't he know their questions? Didn't he know this was the reason for their division? Absolutely he did. He had a reason for not clearing it up. You go back and read Matthew 16 and Mark 8 and Luke 9 and notice that when his disciples, Peter included, said, we believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, one of the next things he told them was, don't tell anyone I'm the Christ. He had a purpose for that. And as we're going to talk about in a later lesson, God sometimes does things in ways that we wouldn't first think would be the right way to do it. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. There's always a good reason that he has for it. So it's not that Jesus never wanted anyone to know that he was born in Bethlehem. Instead, it was a part of the plan of God not to publicly announce it until after the resurrection. And why not? Well, you think about it. When he admitted that he was the Christ, the Jewish authorities used it to get him crucified. The fact remains, he was born in Bethlehem. Luke 2 records the history of his birth, and I'd like you to turn there now. Luke 2. And we're going to read verses 1 to 7 together. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. It says there in verse 1, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. The census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So in the days of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, we're told Augustus issues an order that everyone within this Roman-ruled province should be registered. And in verse 3 it says, everyone went to their own towns to be registered. This registration of people would have been similar in ways to our current census. Accounting would be made, records would be created that contained information taken from those counts. We do this for all kinds of statistics, and the Romans would do it primarily for taxation and for military purposes. But while census workers still maybe not for too much longer, come to our homes and make records of demographic information. This was not always the case in ancient Rome. According to the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, page 772, there has been discovered an old public notice from the year AD 104 that was discovered in Egypt. And Egypt was under the control of Rome in 104 AD. It confirms that when Rome had a census, families who had left their native district were required to return to their home district for registration. Read it with me. Gaius Vibius, chief prefect of Egypt, because of the approaching census, it's necessary for all those residing for any cause away from their own districts to prepare to return at once to their own governments, in order that they may complete the family administration of the enrollment, and that the tilled lands may retain those belonging to them. So you say that's really what happened in those days. You would go back to your hometown to be counted. In the days of such a census, think about what that would be like. Try to imagine that. There would be many families moving from here to there as they return temporarily to their home district. The roads of the empire, I would imagine, would be busier than usual during this time, perhaps similar to our holiday times when people are going home. And that helps to explain why the inn in Bethlehem had no room in it. What an inconvenient time it must have been. In coming to Bethlehem, think about it. Joseph would have had to have left his work in the city of Nazareth, his business relationships, any other responsibilities temporarily on hold, or at least remotely handled in some way during the enrollment. Mary was apparently quite pregnant at the time, since she gave birth while still in their temporary circumstances. And of all places, I think about giving birth in a manger, and I wonder, really, did no one notice? Do you realize that when you start to put together what the circumstances would have been like, these facts alone suggest that there would have been quite a few people who could testify where Joseph and the heavily pregnant Mary were when the baby was born. There would no doubt, let me put the first one up here. There would no doubt be some acquaintances, perhaps friends, family, work associates who would be aware of their travels. We're told as well that there were shepherds that were told the news about what had happened, and they came and saw the child and then, spoke far and wide about what they saw. But there would have been a lot of witnesses who could attest to the fact of where Joseph and Mary were at this point in time when the baby was born. We just saw, we should understand that official registration records would have been taken at this point in time. We have very good reason to believe there would have been these records. A census record has been uncovered from the year AD 48 that recorded a description of the inhabitants of the house. I have that up here as well. This is up from the same article in the encyclopedia. Read it with me. To Dorian, chief magistrate, and to Didymus, town clerk, from Thurmaltharian, the daughter of Thunis, with her guardian Apollonius, the son of Sotates. The inhabitants of the house belonging to me in the south lane are Thurmaltharian, a freedwoman of the aforesaid Sotates, about 65 years of age, of medium height, with honey-colored complexion, having a long face and a scar on the right knee. Yeah, you see the level of detail in this record. And then it concludes by, I, the aforesaid Thurmaltharian, swear by Tiberius Claudius Caesar Emperor that I have assuredly, honestly, and truthfully presented the preceding return of those living with me, and that no one else lives with me. If I were swearing truly, may it be well with me, if falsely, the opposite. Do you get the idea? I mean, they kept records. And you're going to report everybody who's in your family, right? These records would have existed as a testimony somewhere to the truth of the matter that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Of course, there's also the matter of Herod's massacre of the infants or innocents, as it's sometimes referred to. As you go into Matthew chapter 2 and you see how Herod gave the order to destroy all the male babies under 2 in the town of Bethlehem. You can't just make up a story like that and try to pass it off as truth if you're going to have people take you seriously. People are going to be able to know, back in the first century for sure, whether or not this event really happened. The question would remain, why did it happen? Why did he order it? Well, not only this, nothing was ever proven otherwise about the birthplace of Jesus. The prophecy in Micah was so well understood that when Jesus' tomb was found empty and the apostles began proclaiming that the murdered Jesus was now the risen Christ, one of the easiest ways for the enemies of Jesus to discredit and shut down the apostles was to just prove he hadn't been born in Bethlehem. It should have been easy to do if it were true. Fact was, he was born in Bethlehem. Nothing they could say about it. And he fulfilled the prophecy, Jesus did, of Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. I want to bring you back to Professor Stoner from the beginning of this lesson. Here's what Mr. Stoner wrote in his small book about this particular prophecy. He said, "One man in how many the world over has been born in Bethlehem?" He says, "The best estimate which we can make of this comes from the attempt to find out the average population of Bethlehem from Micah down to the present time and divide it by the average population of the earth during the same period. One member of the class was an assistant in the library, so he was assigned to get this information. He reported at the next meeting that the best determination of the ratio he could determine was 1 to 280,000. Since the probable population of the earth has averaged less than 2 billion, the population of Bethlehem has averaged less than 7,150 people. And so our answer may be expressed in the form that, one in this number, 1 in 280,000, which is 2.8 times 10 to the 5th, was born in Bethlehem. All right, 1 in 280,000, he said, would be the odds that you could take a random person and say he was born in Bethlehem. Now, there are 3 quick things that I want you to note from what I just read to you. Number 1, Mr. Stoner's estimate comes from a student who looked up statistics in the library. It might surprise you, as it did me, to find out that the effort was really not more rigorous than that. And we're going to have some more to say about that in a future lesson with the other prophecies as well, and how he came up with them. But that's it, going to the library and making an estimate. Number 2, Mr. Stoner repeatedly challenges the reader in his book by saying things like, if the reader doesn't agree with the estimates given, he may make his own estimate and then carry them through to their logical conclusions. You see what he's saying? Here's the number we came up with. If you don't agree with the number, don't just say you don't agree with the number and then forget about what we're talking about here. You come up with your own number. Don't be lazy. Don't turn off your brains. Think about it. Right? What is your number? And let me ask you, what would you estimate as the likelihood of a person being born in Bethlehem? Think about that. Number 3, what we need to realize is that all Mr. Stoner is giving us is the probability you can take a random person off the face of the earth and find out he's from Bethlehem. Right? By itself, that's not actually a startling piece of information to me. How many of you are from a small town? I was born in Gainesville, Georgia, in the U.S. Population 34,000. I don't think it's changed much over decades. And do you realize that if I use the same type of calculation as Mr. Stoner's student to estimate the probability you can take a random person off the face of the earth and find out he was born in Gainesville, Georgia, I would get roughly the same kind of probability, right? Wow, that makes me special. You see, it's not that statistic alone that is amazing. What is amazing is that a recognized prophet from the year 700 BC wrote that the special anointed king to come, the Son of God, the king who would destroy all on earth who opposed him and would bless all those who put their trust in him, would one day come from a small town, and he named the small town. And so compared to the whole population of the world that's ever lived, there is a relatively small, minuscule pool of candidates that would fit just this one qualification of the Messiah. I'm from Gainesville. I can't be the Messiah. I don't think any of you are from Bethlehem. You can't be the Messiah. Just one prophecy, this one, requiring exact fulfillment with such a specific detail, removes 99.996% of possible candidates. That's the stat. 99.9996%. What if you add more prophecies that are specific? We're not going to talk about Daniel chapter 2 in detail in this series of lessons, but there's a prophecy there that leads to the conclusion Messiah's kingdom will be established not in the days of the Babylonians, not in the days of the Medo-Persians, not in the days of the Greeks, but in the days of the kings of the Roman Empire, and not afterward. Right? What does that new specific detail do to your pool of candidates? Right? The 1 in 280,000 was from the time of the prophet all the way down. What happens when you say only during this specific period of time? You make that pool of candidates a whole lot smaller. And we're still only talking about 2 prophecies. A whole lot smaller. You see, the chances of one man randomly fulfilling all of these prophecies, it's impossible. And that's what makes fulfilled prophecy such an amazing evidence that Jesus is the Christ. And I look forward to digging into this more with you. Tomorrow we're going to look at the second and third prophecies on that list. The next day, Saturday, we're going to look at 2 lessons that take us through the 7th prophecy on the list. And then Sunday we'll look at the 8th and then have some conclusions. I hope you'll come back, and I hope this has been encouraging for you to think about. As we close, I want to finish with this point. The prophecy in Micah 5, verse 2, "You, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler in Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." If I remember correctly, that's the NIV translation. I'm not quite sure which one it is. Many have asked the question, well, how would have Jews in the past understood that phrase, from ancient times? Because it says, the one who will be ruler in Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Well, apparently the Hebrew word used there could be used at times to refer to things that are just old in history. And it's been suggested that maybe the Jews would have understood this word to referring to, the promise made about this ruler long before in the times of David. Interesting thing about this Hebrew word is that's not the only meaning. That's not the only shade of meaning of it. In Psalm 90 and verse 2, we find that word used as well concerning God. And it's used in this sense. Beginning in verse 1 of Psalm 90, it says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting. You are God." That's the other shade of meaning of this Hebrew word. It means eternal. And when you stop and you think about what it would say then, it says this one who will be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from eternity. You're talking about something a little more amazing. Not a little more, way more amazing than just the idea of old in history. In John 8 and verse 58, Jesus said, "Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was," what? "I am." When he said that, the crowd knew what he meant by those words. The grammar of that is a little strange. Before Abraham was, I am. So what does that mean? Well, they knew what it meant. They knew that God had told Moses in Exodus chapter 3, my name is I am that I am. When Jesus said this, before Abraham was I am, he was claiming, I have deity, I have God. It says in the next verse, the Jews took up stones to throw at him because it was blasphemy to them. But if Jesus really is who he claimed to be, and he is, you need to think about who they were throwing stones at. What did Psalm 2 say about the Son who would come? But kiss the Son, lest he be angry. Those who stand against him will fall. They will fail. They will perish. He will bless all those who put their trust in him. What is your relationship like with Jesus? That's going to be a constant refrain, because if you get excited about this like me and you just it's built up within your heart, this is real, this is true, Jesus is who he claimed to be, then the next obvious question is, well, what's your relationship like with him? Whose side are you on? If there's any way the congregation here can help someone tonight in their relationship with that King, you're invited to let us know. We'll be glad to talk to you, open the scriptures, and help you see exactly what he wants you to do. I'm going to call on John now to come forward and lead us in the final song.